Alright, welcome back. We're going to be playing another game of chess here. So let's start it here. Search for an opponent. And we have a 1670, so about 1700 rated player, and we're playing as white, the white pieces. So it's looking like this is going to be another king pawn game, and we have the Philidor defense here, to which I like to respond d4 here. And we see that in a lot of openings where black will play d6 on move 2 or 3. A lot of times a book move to that is d4, immediately imposing the big center on your opponent if they do not take. So yeah, they take with a pawn, and of course we will take with the knight here. The reason I didn't take with a queen is because it walks into knight c6, and I don't like the fact that that comes with tempo, and it would force me to go to a back home, I guess. So yeah, we have bishop e7, play knight c3, another standard development move. We have knight f6. I believe to this we can respond like bishop f4. And I don't want to commit my light square bishop yet, simply because if knight c6 hits the board, I can transpose this, is my thought process, into a variation that I know pretty well. So, but bishop c4 would also be an alternative move, kind of straightforward there. Straightforward, going into an attack, I guess, on the f7 pawn. Alright, so we have castles, and I'm going to play queen d2, looking for signaling to my opponent that I'm probably going to go to castle queen side here and just start a pawn storm on this side of the board. So we have c5, kind of grabbing back space on the queen side here. So he might be trying to signal me, like, don't you dare castle that way. Can I play knight b5? Knight db5. Because of something like a6, can't we just take this backward pawn here? Take, queen. And he does not have something like that at the end of the line. So let's go with this and castle, and then the pressure on this backward pawn here is going to be tremendous because of the bishop that's been developed on f4. You might even have to sacrifice it or something in order to maintain somewhat equality, and especially if we castle, it's going to be like everything's going to be pointed at this backward pawn. So c5, I mean, it attacks our knight, but it weakens the e6 pawn, the d6 pawn, a lot. And now there's not many good ways for black to defend it. He has 2 defenders, but we have 1, 2, 3 attackers here. And he can't stack his rook in time, I don't think. He can move his knight back, yeah. But now castles is adding yet another attacker here. So castles take. Yeah, castles is adding yet another attacker, and it's something I wanted to do anyway because we're looking to do a pawn storm on the king side here. But he's kind of using the placement of my knight to start his own pawn storm, but it still loses a pawn here. And I think this is also like very, very bad for our opponent already. So we have the big exchange. And yeah, bishop e6. And now I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, where do I develop my bishop? Because if I develop it here, I'm blocking my own rook from ever returning home. If I develop it here, of course, it just gets taken and I can't develop it to b5. So I do have a little bit. I can actually develop it to e2 pretty safely. But another interesting thing I could maybe prepare is like an f4, f5 push using the placement of his bishop in a sense to create a space advantage and more pawns on the king side. Is this a premature attack? Maybe. Maybe it's premature. But I don't see a lot of ways that our opponent can punish us for f4. And it doesn't preclude us from playing bishop e2 later on. Like even if we wanted to, let's say, support a g4 push before f4. We can play bishop f2 here. So I think this I can play knight d5 preemptively here, preemptively avoiding this push. And the thing is that if he now pushes, he might walk into losing this pawn here if this knight ever leaves. And I don't think I'm worried about my rook getting trapped behind enemy lines. But let's see. Maybe this also merits some consideration. f5. I think f5 is a good move, probably either way. A d5 I like visually. Let's take with the rook. And now I think I'm going to look to develop my bishop to like this diagonal probably. What is the best way to do that? We could throw in like g4 and then bishop g2 is a possibility. We could throw in bishop e7, bishop e2, bishop f3, bishop e2, bishop f3. We could also play this move, and the purpose of rook to d6 was kind of like a weird move, is just to restrict his knight from being developed. And then because his knight is restricted, he also has a hard time developing this rook to a useful square. So I like this actually. And it also eventually clears this diagonal here. So I think this is probably a solid way to develop our bishop here. I don't think putting the knight there was exactly the smartest idea, because now this comes with tempo. A knight there, we play connect 4. Play connect 4, and then depending on where his knight jumps, is this running into like a weird knight maneuver? It could be. So I think maybe the safer option is to go like rook d5, d4. Rook d4 and then rook d1 before connecting 4 here. And we're going to build a very solid pawn structure on the dark squares here, attempting to restrict his knight as much as we can. Rook d1 is probably my next move. Unless, yeah, okay. Let's double stack our rooks. Did he not just... Oh, his point is to anchor his knight, I see. Yeah, but I think that is pretty bad. I think I can exchange off. After he anchors his knight there, we exchange off, forces pawns to be doubled, ruin his pawn structure further, and then perhaps even, yeah. Or we could even play like here. I don't think his pawn pushes really have any merit on the king's side. We could even play like here, threatening these pawns. And then here and here, looking to place our rooks on the most active squares as possible. And the endgame is kind of, it's not as intensive in calculation as the middle game, because there are less pieces on the board here, so you can, I mean, it's pretty easy to see 2 attackers, 2 defenders, and then we're getting in this rook. We improve its position. I mean, and there's like not, now we can push this pawn and return our rook. And this pawn still hangs. And everything's hanging, basically. I mean, this pawn can be attacked easily. You can play like this. But after takes, takes, I think maybe the most efficient way is just takes, and like king here. It's probably the most efficient way to win enough material to be winning here. And the reason I play king d2 is prophylactic, because I don't want his rook. We could snag another pawn, but I think he already has basically overloaded the amount of threats on the board here. We're pressuring both these pawns with our rook, and his rook is left to the defensive role. And we're also threatening just to steamroll these pawns up the side of the board here after we remove these other pawns. So endgame, generally always you want to focus on targeting pawns if you can. So we take this in an endgame, but I think this is like clearly a 1 endgame for white here. So we have pretty easy calculation here. We have king c3, rook here, takes, rook takes, check, takes, and we're threatening to win everything here. So king here, and if checks, he's not threatening anything. So we just take the pawn. And if rook goes to e2, we take this pawn. Okay, so now he spends a tempo defending this pawn, but he loses this pawn in return. So now we can drop our king back, takes, and have a double attack on these pawns as well with our rook. And we still maintain our material advantage. And if pushes, we can just take, because if here we check and take this pawn. Let's see, let's calculate here. Takes, this takes. You could even have rook a3. Rook a3 takes, here, 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 here. And then our pawn promotes. So of course we're not obligated to take, so we can simply move our king over. Or play c4 because it pushes, takes. Yeah, I'm probably making this more complicated than it needs to be, but I think the correct move is probably moving the king over. And then we move here. Because of takes, this, and then our king's reach. Okay. Now, rook a8. And if he checks, we move pawn, we take the pawn, and then move our king over to promote our other pawns. And obviously we're threatening. I mean, he might try something like this, but we play c4. Or we can play rook here. I mean, rook here, checks, king moves, takes here. And the three pawns are not stoppable. The fact that we have three of them is so a way to prolong the game, I think, would be to move here. And now we're threatening some serious tactics here if our opponent does not. So now, yeah, let's centralize our pieces here. Go here. And this should be easily winning, especially with the black king on the other side of the board here. We have +3 pawns. Defend our pawn. And we're in time. If we get checked here, we can obviously defend our rook and use our pawns as a shield here. Alright. And then we will attempt to advance our pawn and get a rook behind here to support. And now we have a pretty simple calculation here. His king cannot chase our pawn up the board past the rook. So we just go, promote, and then use our other pawn to promote, and then take. And our king is safe here. And this is resignable for our opponent. It was resignable a long time ago, but yeah. We will attempt to checkmate him efficiently here. So, yeah, let's start with this check here, and then depending on where the king goes, we can just probably win his rook or get a ladder mate on him here. And a ladder mate, obviously, you're using these two pieces to cut off files until the king is forced into the corner and mated. So we get a chance to demonstrate some basic mating net concepts here on our opponents. Okay, good game. We have resignation here, and we can do a game review. I'll let this load for a second. All right. And we'll pull up the game in a new tab here. So we have the Philidor defense opening, which is signaled by the move d6 on move 2. And after that I play d4, and we have the exchange in the center. I'd note that queen takes is still possible, but it does run into knight takes c6 or knight to c6 at some point. So it's maybe a little bit suboptimal when you're considering moves like that in the opening. So bishop to e7, we have knight to c3, standard development, knight f6, and bishop to f4, castles, and queen to d2, creating a battery that points towards the king side here. And I'm looking to castle long ways so we can start, for instance, a pawn storm. And c5, I think you'll see c5 in a lot of positions in like the Rui Lopez, for instance, but in this case it doesn't really work because of how weak that d6 pawn is. And so I was able to get away with moving the knight to b5, actually advancing the knight, because this doesn't come in time to save the pawn, the a6 move, because now I have 3 attackers all of a sudden on this pawn, and you've removed a defender by advancing the pawn. So knight to e8 is kind of the only way you can add another defender that I see, because it's on the dark square. So then we have castles, just adding more pressure. And then, yeah, this just loses the pawn. And the pawn was all we needed to convert an advantage in the endgame here. So queen takes, we have rook takes, and now this big exchange, we're already looking at almost an endgame here, because there's not a lot of pieces left on the board. And an extra pawn can be incredibly powerful in the endgame. And an extra pawn, like in the opening or the middle game, doesn't mean much. An extra pawn in the endgame, if you're able to convert that middle game or that opening into like a final endgame, and it depends on the pawn structure and a lot of other different variables, but a lot of the times this extra pawn can be very good. So I play f4, b5, and I like the look of knight to d5, takes, rook takes, c4, and these pawn pushes don't really merit much to like a kingside attack because of the fact that black has like no pieces to be behind these pawns supporting them. He only has the two rooks left, and the two rooks and the knight, unless white messes up really badly, are not going to be enough to checkmate this king. So we have g3, kind of looking to play connect 4 on the dark squares here, build a solid pawn chain. Then bishop to h3 here. Yeah, the knight jump, and then I played rook d4 because I was scared, like, let's say this, of knight e4, and if I try to come back attacking it, you just run like face first into a fork here. So I was calculating those knight jumps. I played, rook d4, kind of a safe move, just getting the rook out of black's territory and also playing it defensively here on this pawn. And then a5, and then I double my rooks. So that's what you want to do a lot of times when you own a file like this. You want to double your rooks and get them on the file. h5, we have e5, and then I just exchange my bishop because I'm up a pawn here, and I know this on top of this weakness here, that the pawn and this weakness will be more than enough for me to convert this endgame most likely. So we have f5, and then it's kind of a little bit weird how you want to, like, moves can look weird that are actually stronger when you're, how do I want to word this? When you are moving your rooks in the endgame, you want to move them in such a way that they are as active as you can possibly make them without losing material. So for instance, like rook e1 isn't bad, but it is a little bit passive because all it is doing now, its only function is just protecting this pawn. And now what if he doubles his pawn? Or what if he doubles his rooks on this file? Now I have to play rook e4 and like protect it twice. And then we're running into like maybe issues here. I mean, you could play like e6, but the concept is the same, that like I don't want the only purpose of my rooks to be defending my pawn. That's why I played rook d5, which now you can see the rook both attacks a pawn and defends my pawn. And in the case that he doubles here, now I can play rook e1. And what that allows is now he has two attackers, but even now I can move my rook to an even more active square, and now both of my rooks have like a double purpose of defending and attacking these pawns. So after f6, you can just cement in, I guess, this pawn chain here. He tries to break that with g6, and I just, I found the most efficient way. I guess the computer way is rook takes, because you want to play as simply as possible, I guess, is a lesson also for the endgame. You want to, and that's hard to explain, like what is simple a lot of the times, but here I'm just counting, like if I went here and did this capture instead, this is allowing the rook to come into e8, and now the king moves, and then his rook is coming back here, right? His king is also going to block this pawn from coming up, and now it's like a lot more unclear, I thought, than the other position, which was rook takes b5, and then after he takes here, you swing the rook back around, take on f5, and then this exchange happens as it did in the game, and then I go king d2, preventing any shenanigans here on my first and second rank with his rook. So this is all about endgame technique here. And then we had a4, and just play, you know, king c3, and then take the pawn, drop back the rook in order to pressure all the pawns on the board. And I chose to take this pawn because now we're threatening a fork, and we can drop back to re-threaten the same thing. So as soon as king advances, and this, yeah, this position can be tricky, I guess, because if you allow him to take and then somehow get out of the way, his king could maybe escort this pawn down to become a queen. So you want to make sure that positions like this, and I think he could have even taken like on c2 here, would be interesting. But then we just have this pawn that can push. But this is what I was calculating. Rook takes g3, and then, yeah, I played rook to a3, which is still winning, of course. I mean, pretty much everything is winning in this position. But the king goes to f3, and we're not scared of the revealed check because our rook is guarded. And now rook goes to a8. And this position is very clearly winning for white here. The revealed check, we take the pawn, and we have enough tempo to get back and defend our pawns with the king. And then, just for kind of like demonstration purposes, a lot of times a good way to win when you have pawns and a rook is you put your rook behind the pawns, get them up to advance up the board here, and then force the opponent's rooks into like passivity here, because they have to get on the square to block the promotion, and then you can just use like other threats like your king or another pawn to promote and gain material. So with that, I mean, the rest of the game is pretty straightforward. He just resigned in this position, but mate was soon to be on the board no matter what there. So I guess now we can go into analysis of the opening. Let's go opening analysis, Philidor defense. Let's look at the Philidor here. So d6. There's different ways to play this. You can go bishop c4 is very viable and probably could be even a better line than d4. d4 I consider kind of more straightforward, like your intentions, which can be good and bad in chess games. But anyways, takes, is the exchange variation, which is probably the most common variation. I'm not sure actually on that, but bishop e7 I think is also book move. And then knight c6 transposes into like a Ruy Lopez type setup. At least I would transpose it. I would play bishop b5. Knight to f6 is more pure Philidor, so I go bishop f4, waiting to commit this light square bishop, because also in a lot of times in Philidor or like Steinitz defense positions, you want to play bishop f4 and queen d2, creating this battery that just points towards the king side, and that has a potential of creating a hook here, like on h6, that you could sacrifice for. So for instance, like I'm just going to make like random moves, but let's say instead of that we have like castles. And now this is just for like demonstration purposes. I don't know if this line is actually that good, but now, because let's say he's afraid of our pawn arriving on h6, he pushes h6, now we can, let's say, long castles, and we have like we have serious threats later on of like sacrificing our bishop on this hook, as I like to call it, on h6, and getting our queen in for like a checkmating attack, either with the bishop supporting on like c4 or d3 here, if that makes sense. But yeah, this is just a sample line. Black could totally play something else like this, but that is just an idea of this battery here that I can demonstrate. But yeah, what did our opponent play? I don't think our opponent played... Yeah, our opponent played c5, which you do see kind of sometimes in like old Steinitz or like Ruy Lopez games, but in the Philidor, I think he should have just gone with knight c6 or castling. I mean, either one is fine, but castling, our plan is pretty obvious. We're going to castle long and then start a pawn storm, either with like h3, g4, something like that, towards the king side here. And then black is probably going to do likewise. I didn't mean to make that move. That's a blunder. But black is going to do likewise on the queen side, most likely. So, I mean, I can just maybe demonstrate that real quick. So like castles, and then knight c6 is still fine here. You could have like rook e8. Knight c6 is probably pretty simple, and then you don't want to exchange this knight here anymore on c6 and open files they can use toward your king. The engine is saying like knight f5, which is a little bit counterintuitive to me because your pawn structure is a little bit suboptimal here, but I guess you don't really care that much, and this pawn, advanced pawn, could be even like used to support like a final pawn storm, I guess, in this direction. We also have good diagonals for the bishop, for the light square bishop now we can use. So like rook c8, and we can have like bishop to d3, bishop to c4, or just like going for h4, starting the pawn storm, as I was suggesting all this time. So yeah, and this is like +1 already for white. A very good, solid like position you get out of the opening, because our attack, it would seem, is arriving sooner than anything black has got going on this side of the board. So in essence, that is the Philidor defense here. That's just like a couple lines of it, similar to what our opponent played. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one.